So, Derek, Ash, and John, I don't know if you guys know this, but 1998 was kind of a big year for video games. It started off with Resident Evil 2 in January, there was StarCraft in March, Banjo-Kazooie in June, Metal Gear Solid in September, Half-Life on November 19th, and then 2 days later, Ocarina of Time on November 21st, 1998. Now, I don't know if you guys also noticed this, but today is also November 21st, only 20 years in the future. So I thought it'd be fun to talk about our experience with the Ocarina of Time, given that's now the 20th anniversary for this game, which is arguably one of the biggest anniversaries of all time, although alongside some of these other greats from that same year. Truly a fantastic year. So I guess to start things off, I want to hear about what you guys' general experiences were with the game at the time. For instance, for you, John, I think you were on the younger side when Ocarina of Time came out. So
I was 4. I was 4 years old when this game came out.
That, you know what, I'm not going to accept that as an excuse for you, so you better have told me you played that on launch day.
Yeah, I was there day one. Now, I didn't play this until the GameCube. I got it with Wind Waker when it came with the special Ocarina of Time disc. And I remember playing Wind Waker and just having this game in the case side by side. And I ended up preferring Ocarina of Time, this game which by that standard looked inferior to Wind Waker, and I ended up having a better time with Ocarina of Time.
Wow.
I think that just kind of goes to the game's merit. Like, even when time goes on, when visuals get better, you just can't beat this open design to this game. And even today, I still think it holds up really well. Obviously, Zelda games have changed a lot over the years, and but I don't think any of them are really better than one another. Like, all Zelda games kind of have their strengths. Like, Wind Waker's strength is it's this giant ocean. Majora's Mask is an intimate game. And Ocarina of Time, I guess, is kinda like a default 3D Zelda. But the design behind it is so clever. And I think it still has some of the best dungeons in the series. So, but yeah, to answer your question, I was very young when this game came out. But yeah, I got around to it on the GameCube, and since then I've gone back to play the N64 version. And I don't think this game plays any better with a GameCube controller. I feel like this is made for an N64 controller, if that makes sense. Like, playing it with anything else just kind of feels like cheating.
Oh, I mean, I'm right there with you. When I replayed it for this discussion, I wanted to do it on the original hardware. So I found my 64, got my composite cables hooked up to my TV. Ash, you are older than John, like both Derek and myself. Where were you at the time of Ocarina of Time?
Well, I was about 14 or 15 when this game came out, so perfect time. You know, I was in high school, and I had time to play the game, as a lot of high schoolers have free time, and I remember, of course, it was right before the holiday break, which was also exciting, but it's amazing to me that I remember very clearly the day I got Ocarina of Time, and it still stands out to me in my mind. It's a clear day in my memory, and I guess that's because the game left such a tremendous impression on me. But I remember going with my parents to the local electronics boutique, and that really ages this discussion because electronics boutique isn't around anymore. And
so they were bought by GameSpot, right? Or GameStop.
Yeah, they were GameStop. Yeah. So, I got Ocarina of Time from my local EB, as we called it back then, and brought it home, and I just remember the first time I stepped out into Kokiri Forest, and I was just, even back then, it's so small now when you look at it, but back then, Kokiri Forest felt impossibly huge. It felt groundbreaking to be exploring this 3D space in a Zelda game, and I remember how weird I thought the automatic jumping was, but a few minutes later I was like, oh, automatic jumping kind of makes sense for this game. This is kind of cool. And I just, it stands out clearly in my mind, my first few minutes playing Ocarina of Time, and I just remember feeling pure magic.
Mm-hmm. And how about you, Derek?
Well, for you guys, Ash had this huge experience about how, got Zelda. He was all excited about it. But for me, it was just another Saturday because I had not played Zelda before that point. I had no idea about a hype cycle. I didn't know the game was coming out. I maybe had a few magazines talking about it, but I was still in the process of learning more about just games in general, getting into the magazines and stuff like that. And at the time, I had a PlayStation. I didn't have the N64 at all, and I just had moved away from Nintendo at the time. And the funny thing is I was still very much aware of Nintendo and the N64. Like, I was always aware of the SNES. Always wanted an SNES, but since I already had the Genesis, parents wouldn't let me get an SNES as well. And so the N64 came out, got the PlayStation along with it, and it was just, I kept on that path.
You heretic.
But every time I went to... Yeah, exactly. But every time I went to a mall, you went to Sears, you went to, God, it wasn't, I don't even know if Walmart was a thing back then, but, you know, any type of mall that had a video game section, they'd have a kiosk there where they had games set up. And the game that was always in the N64 at the time was Ocarina of Time. And this was way after launch. I didn't play it until much later, probably late 99. But I'd always see it in there, and it'd always be in Ocarina Field, and I'd be, not Ocarina Field, but Hyrule Field, and just be blown away by just how big it was, but also, what do I do? Like, I'd pick it up the controller and try to figure out where I'm supposed to go, and I'm like, I had no idea what to do. But I remember, like, it kept drawing me back, especially because everybody was talking about it. Even though I didn't play it, everybody was talking about it and how amazing it was. But it wasn't... It was a little while until I actually got to play it myself, but I did play it originally on the N64.
Yeah, you kind of touched on something there that, I mean, everyone really was talking about it, especially with us, or most of us, being in school or preschool, perhaps in John's case. Yeah, this was a big event. Like, this was effectively, I mean, I think the following year was when the first Star Wars prequels came out, and this was probably the closest thing to that I experienced myself in terms for video games. And, I mean, it was a big event for gaming. This was Zelda's first, foray into 3D. And it was arguably Nintendo's biggest game up to that point, aside from Mario 64. Like, this was a huge event, and there was a massive marketing campaign for it. Nintendo, for one of the first times, was showing, like, trailers for the game in theaters, which was almost unheard of at that point. And that trailer, by the way, or a commercial for it as well, was epic. Do you remember that song that they used for the trailer, which they reused for Twilight Princess?
Yes.
Right? Like, it just made it feel like an event, and it was an event. And I remember when I got to, like, right after school on November 21st, I remember I got home, I probably ran home. My parents took me to Toys R Us. Well, first off, I remember being almost a little bit disappointed that everyone else wasn't there. I'm like, where is everyone? Like, it was such a low-key event. Like, I remember just going to the little window where to pick up your game with a card you had, and they just handed it to me over the counter, and no one else was there. I'm like, where is the hype for this? What's going on? Maybe everyone showed up earlier in the day, I'm not sure, but it didn't matter for me. I was super excited to get home, plug it in and play it. And sure enough, that's all I did for hours. I didn't let go, or I didn't stop playing until dinner time, and then I think even right after I went right back to it. And I was obsessed with this game for the following weeks. I remember on Thanksgiving Day, we went to my grandparents, as we often did, for Thanksgiving dinner, and I brought my entire Nintendo 64 over, hooked it up in their basement, and that's all I did. I was completely antisocial, and I just played Ocarina of Time. And I remember I had just gone to the future portion, 7 years in the future, and that's all I played. So yeah, this was a big event, and for numerous reasons. It was Zelda's first foray into 3D, but it did so much to make Zelda work in 3D that would also inspire other games. So we touched on some of this already with a big open world, but also other elements like Z targeting, which allowed you to easily target enemies in a 3D space, the interact button, the no jumping, or the automated jumping rather. Like, there was so much this game did to push it forward. So yeah, and that's might be a good or a good time to maybe launch into that portion, is just the importance of Ocarina of Time in general, both for the Zelda series and gaming in general moving forward.
Well, for starters, it's kind of crazy that Ocarina of Time came out in 1998, and Twilight Princess and Skyward Sword essentially have the same control scheme, as in like, you move around and you just sort of change the camera with the Z button. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's crazy that Zelda's controls basically didn't change in like that 10+ year gap, even more than that, like 15 years almost.
Right.
I guess that just goes to show like they nailed it on their first try. Like, they tried to make a 3D Zelda. And they did. Like, they pretty much perfected it. And the only way to change it was to, like, completely evolve Zelda.
Well, and open world games are a dime a dozen nowadays, but back then, that first time you stepped out onto Hyrule Field, and of course, after you got past Capra Gabra, that annoying frickin' owl, God, and of course you're mashing through, and then it defaults to, yes, I want to hear it again, and then you have to go through it again. Yeah, maybe that hasn't aged so well. But after that, that first time you step out onto Hyrule Field, it's kind of like that proto Breath of the Wild moment where you're like, oh my god, there's this huge world expanding out before me, and I can go wherever I want. Now, the reality was, no, you couldn't go wherever you want, but the game did a great job of masking that and making you feel like this was your adventure and the whole world was laid out before you. And, this is something we're used to nowadays, but back then, there was nothing like Hyrule Field back in the day. Like, that was a big moment.
Oh, yeah, it was a huge moment, and you kind of touched on something there with it being like a prototype, or maybe not prototype rather, but like an earlier version of Breath of the Wild, where it did feel like you're stepping into this big, expansive world. And it even has a similar introduction where you're funneled down like a small corridor, or in Breath of the Wild's case, it was a tunnel, before you then emerge into this giant world, or seemingly giant world. And the thing that kind of sucks is, maybe not really sucks, but for someone going back to Ocarina of Time these days, there's no way to relive that experience. There's no way they can get the feeling that we did back then. And as you mentioned, the closest comparison that there would be now would be Breath of the Wild, which obviously has a much bigger world. But back then, that world felt like Breath of the Wild. And it's something that can't be conveyed by replaying it, 20 years later.
I think the impact is still there, though. You start off in the Kokiri Forest, and that place is it's so small in comparison, and it feels like this is the entire world. Because everyone who lives there basically always lives there, and they never leave. And so to leave that place, it's like you're entering this giant, this world that no one knows exists, in a sense. And that reveal is just so climactic. So I think that there is still that feeling of suspense and wonder when you go into Hyrule Field, and obviously it's not the same today, but I still think it does have an impact for sure.
I kind of didn't have that impact, to be honest, when I first played it. And I think it is because of those store kiosks, me always being on the Hyrule Field. So I was used to it. I knew what lied beyond the Kokiri Forest. So it was the individual moments that stood out to me the first time I played it. It's like, oh my god, this is what the castle is like. Oh my god, that's what Kakariko Village is like, or Death Mountain, or the Home of the Zoras. Like, those areas, like seeing the designs of those is where the game blew my mind. By that point, Hyrule Field didn't really hold much for me until I got Epona.
Right. Yeah, that was a big thing that the game also introduced, is Epona, which has also showed up in pretty much every other Zelda game since.
Yeah, and that completely recontextualized Hyrule Field all over again. Once you rescued Epona in the future and you were just riding around, it was a completely new sensation and a totally new way to explore the field. And again, that was something that hadn't really been done a whole lot in games before, horse riding. So it was a big deal back then. And yeah, that was one of the most important moments in Ocarina of Time, I would say, is when you get Epona.
Yeah, it was just so rewarding, both getting it, the process for getting it, where you have to go to Lon Lon Ranch and do all these kind of tasks, and also just riding it around. I mean, it's kind of funny looking back now, because the horses, was quite important in Ocarina of Time, whereas in Breath of the Wild, the horse was kind of almost pushed into the background, where you didn't really need the horse so much these days. But part of what made, I think, exploring the Hyrule Field feel great too is the fact that even though the world was sectioned off, like there were loading times between each area, like when you go to Castle Town or Gerudo Valley or anywhere besides Hyrule Field, they are segmented. You can still see a lot of that in the actual background. Like, you would see Death Mountain way off in the distance. You could see, or even when you climbed up Death Mountain, you could see Kokiri, or you could see Kakariko Village down below. And even the lights would come on at night. And by the way, that's something else new too, was the day and night cycle in this game, which also just made everything feel more epic, with how it took like an entire day to cross Hyrule Field. They created a great sense of place and immersion with this game that they hadn't quite been able to do previous to it, just because the technology wasn't there.
I love the day-night cycle. Like, when you first enter Hyrule Field, you're pretty much guaranteed to spend the night outside the bridge, just fighting zombies. Because there is no way you're going to make it there just by walking on foot. And you can exploit it by going backwards, but you're not meant to do that, obviously. So either you just roll really fast, or you just spend the night outside. And it's such a clever design decision, because pretty much every player is going to have to wait outside. And it's just like, it's teaching you about the day and night cycle. And it's showing you how dangerous this world can be as well at the same time. I've always loved that. Like,
the teaching moments in Ocarina of Time are so good. Like, how they gradually, like, the Kokiri village is just a training ground for you, but it's hidden so well because you want to meet these characters, you want to see all these areas, you got that little mission to get all the swords, then you just jump right into a dungeon in no time, and then all of a sudden here's a new element with the day-night cycle, and all of a sudden here's a village where a Hyrule Town or the Castle Town where all there's other stuff to explore and more people to talk to, and just it gets more and more expansive as you go along until you're finally set free with after meeting Zelda.
And not only that, but it continues to introduce new and interesting mechanics as you move forwards. For example, Jabu Jabu's belly, how you have to, you have to think in terms of two characters, because you have to carry Ruto with you and set her down on specific switches and put her in specific spaces. And that was completely unlike anything we had seen before, except for maybe Blind's dungeon in A Link to the Past. But even that wasn't really the same kind of thing. And so yeah, even in your third dungeon into Ocarina of Time, you're still being confronted with new and interesting things, to say nothing of the time skip. And then the time skip happens, and that's just, that blew my 14-year-old mind, because it's like, wait, it's the same world, but it's really a whole nother world, and it's so fun re-exploring the world and finding out what exactly has happened to every area in 7 years. And that was such a brilliant decision to go with that time-shifting mechanic.
Especially when you step outside of the Temple of Time for the first time and just see how vastly different the world is. Like, Death Mountain has that swirling fiery vortex above it. Castle Town's destroyed, and there's Redeads, which might be the creepiest enemy everywhere.
Yes.
Yeah, and as soon as you leave the Temple of Time, there's no music. It's just atmosphere.
Right. I love that. It's such a great, it's such an impactful moment. To step back for a second, though, Ash, I mean, I agree with absolutely everything you said. However, looking back now, though, you can see how the basic template for the game is pretty much A Link to the Past. This game is essentially A Link to the Past in 3D. From the starting off with the three initial dungeons before you learn some kind of new mechanic to go to a different world, which has its own set of dungeons. Key difference being is the fact that instead of going to a dark world, it's 7 years in the future, which effectively, from a gameplay perspective, is basically the same, even if narratively it, of course, isn't. But very similar concepts, which, getting back to what you were saying, it does end up feeling different just because of the impact on the story, and also the character change, too, with Link physically aging 7 years.
Well, and not just that, but the game plays with that too. The game story is fairly basic in a broad sense, but when you get into the nitty-gritty and you see how the game kind of, really makes you face the idea of losing your childhood. Like, the game revisits that theme of Link really genuinely losing his childhood because he ages. Yeah, and I mean, even the ending's about that, about him reclaiming his childhood, and I do love that the game makes the player face the implications of that kind of time travel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you touched on Jabu Jabu earlier, Ash, and that just got me thinking. Some of these dungeons are so inventive. The very first dungeon is the Great Deku Tree, and you're basically just going around this living, breathing place. And I think you can really tell that with Lord Jabu Jabu, though. Like, when you're actually inside him, and you can see these tonsils and things sort of hanging from above him. It makes them feel less like just gauntlet sort of puzzles, and more like actual living, breathing places. And temples like the Shadow Temple, where it's almost like this torture dungeon or something. And then there's the well, which is just this awful bloody world, and it's so eerie. And I think more than maybe any other Zelda game, the temples and dungeons in Ocarina of Time just feel like actual places.
Yeah, they really do. And I have to say, even now, I would say the Forest Temple is one of the most atmospheric, just creepy temples or dungeons in all of Zelda. The music absolutely makes that place, and it still, to this day, gets under my skin, and just it's got its own completely unique atmosphere that hasn't been replicated in any other Zelda dungeon since, in my opinion. Even the dungeons it tried to, like the first dungeon in Twilight Princess, whatever it's called.
Right, I know what you mean. No, I'm right there with you. The music is so haunting in that dungeon.
Yeah.
So, again, this is our first time seeing dungeons or temples in 3D. This was basically Nintendo taking, the temples from Indiana Jones and making them work with Zelda, right? It felt like you're going on this mission to find this treasure, being the item, and I guess the main difference being is there's this giant boss at the end of this case. But yeah, it was cool. Who doesn't want to be Indiana Jones? So, it's awesome that you were able to have some of that feeling in a video game. And that kind of gets to another larger point I want to make here, is with some of the games I mentioned, such as Half-Life and more specifically Metal Gear Solid. This is where we started seeing, this is an era we started seeing games try to become more like movies. Maybe not necessarily intentionally, definitely so in Metal Gear Solid's case, but we definitely saw game makers take the opportunity with 3D to make games more cinematic. And Ocarina of Time is no exception. They play around with the camera so much in this game, which is kind of ironic because you don't have too much camera control yourself. We really see the game play up, how epic some of these moments are. whether it's seeing these boss fights from a cool looking perspective, or even with Z targeting, how every battle is framed in a really cinematic way. And also one of my favorite touches is how they play with first person a lot, which is fitting for a game which for the first time you can use first person mode, whether to just look around or aim the slingshot or bow and arrow. Even the game opens up with a first person segment with Navi flying around to find Link.
Yeah, it really does emphasize that 3D space. And you mentioned the bosses. I think these are some of the best bosses in Zelda up until this point. Like, if you compare the bosses that were in Link to the Past to the ones that are in Ocarina of Time, it's a night and day difference. Like, yeah, you can have some fun bosses and memorable ones in Link to the Past, but none of them match the scale or epicness of Ocarina of Time, especially your first time through. Seeing Goma for the first time, just having this giant spider drop from the tree, and it's like, oh, okay, that explains why the Great Deku Tree's in trouble. Or whenever you fight the Dongo and how much bigger they are than anything you've faced up until that point in the series. And just, nowadays you can handle them no problem. They're not really that big of a deal. But at the time, I can only imagine the shift for longtime fans from seeing what was in Link to the Past and seeing the representation here is incredible, especially when you had to fight even just normal enemies like the Darknuts or the Moblins or the Stalfos. Like, that's like, as you said, there's some really cinematic fights, and I loved fighting those the first time I played through this game, just getting that sword and shield element up and feeling like, hey, I'm actually a swordsman playing through this game. This feels really good.
Speaking about A Link to the Past, those bosses, most of them, you can beat them with your sword. Like, a lot of them do not need items at all. I mean, there are a few. But in Ocarina of Time, bosses are also kind of puzzles, and like, to beat them, you have to understand how to beat them. So with a Dodongo, you throw a bomb at it, or you have to use like the bow and arrow or the hook shot, or just something that you got from that dungeon which completes the cycle of teaching that item. I don't know which one I prefer, to be honest. I don't know if I prefer like the action combat of A Link to the Past or the more thought-out method of Ocarina of Time, but there's no taking away that these boss fights are so well designed and all the monsters look spectacular.
Well, this might be a good time, real quick, to maybe hop ahead, or to jump ahead to something else I replayed today. Because while I only replayed up to Dodongo's Cavern, or just past it, I decided to skip ahead to my finished save file and replay Ganondorf and Ganon, I should say. And first off, I forgot what a pain in the ass Ganondorf is with that electric tennis ball. Oh man, that was way harder to time than I remember. I think partially because of the lack of depth, which might be something better on the 3DS, which we'll get to. But I'm specifically, the reason I'm bringing this up is because I wanted to talk about the final battle in the game, which is of course against Ganon himself, the Pig Ganon. And first off, how epic that was, seeing this for the first time in 3D. Still perhaps my favorite boss fight in a Zelda game, certainly against Ganon, or Ganondorf. But also, getting back to what you were saying, John, to being kind of a puzzle, because what they do that's fun in this fight is you literally lose your sword. He knocks your sword away. You can't get to it. It's outside the flames that constrain the battle, and so you have to find some other way to attack Ganondorf. And in my case, I had the big Goron sword, but I purposely decided not to use it to throw myself back into the mindset of 20 years ago for most people. And that's when you have to find something else you can use, such as you could try using the Megaton Hammer, for instance. I'm sure there's other stuff you could try using as well. But then even getting behind Ganon is a pain in the butt, where you can try stunning him with just normal arrows, or if you have light arrows, you can fire them to temporarily stun him. So yeah, like every battle is a puzzle in a way, but it also still feels very action-focused at the same time. So I think Ocarina of Time struck a pretty good balance, whereas Skyward Sword may have gone too far in the direction of being puzzle-based.
Right.
And on the flip side, Twilight Princess has some amazing-looking bosses, but they're so easy. They look spectacular, but they are just so simple, though. I think Ocarina of Time had a way better balance, like you said, Andre.
Well, it's funny, we're talking about the spectacle of some of the biggest bosses in the game, and I completely agree with everything you guys just said, but one of the most memorable bosses for me is actually one of the smallest, and it's one of the most intimate moments in the game, where you're just trucking through the water temple, and all of a sudden you find yourself in this weird mirage-like room, and you see this little silhouette in this tree in the middle, and you're like, what's that? And it's Dark Link, and it's a creepy, cool fight. The way it's done...
Hold up, Ash, real quick.
Yeah.
Did you mention the fact that you had to cross the room first, which is empty, and then it's only...
That's true, I forgot about that. You do have to cross it first, yeah.
Only when you turn around,
forgot it, yeah.
Dark Link appears, yeah.
And that's so cool. And I mean, and that, that's a perfect example of a boss where it's memorable without needing that scale that you guys have been talking about, although I completely agree. That final battle with Ganon, when you realize that you're not done, you just escaped from his castle, you beat Ganondorf, but then, when the text flashes onto the screen as Ganon's roaring and the lightning's flashing, I remember specifically as a teen back in the day, that gave me serious goosebumps. What a moment that was.
Yeah.
I mean, it's one of those things, like, as a Nintendo fan, again, I had no basis for a lot of these things because I hadn't just been introduced to a lot of these Nintendo classics at this point. But I remember going through the game, beating Ganondorf and escaping the castle with Zelda. I'm like, oh, cool, that's a really neat way to finish off the game, just escape the castle as it falls to pieces. What a really cool post-boss moment. And in thinking back to that, it's almost playing on the expectations that people might have for something like Super Metroid, where you do have the final boss and then you have an escape sequence, but no other boss after that. It's just the escape sequence. So Zelda fans or Metroid fans that then played Ocarina of Time might have thought that was the same idea. And no, had to have Ganon come back in that form, in probably one of his most threatening beast forms by far, because Ganondorf is so much more threatening than he ever was in the past games, and it's a brilliant moment.
Well, Ganondorf is a character in this game, whereas in the past games he was pretty much just this pig. Actually made him into an actual character. Like there's an arc. And I love how quite early on in the game, when you first meet him, he's actually kind of remorseful. Like, he plays with Link as if he was just a kid, and I guess he is at the time. But as the game goes on, Ganon develops, and he starts seeing Link as more of a threat, but he's still kind of playing with him. And I think it's the Forest Temple boss, where you have like Phantom Ganon. And even then, like, he's not necessarily trying to kill Link, he's still kind of testing him at that point. And yeah, just that moment in the final boss, you can see how desperate Ganon is at that point, and he's this look of anger on his face as he transforms into Ganon. That's just such a great moment. And my favorite Ganon is still Wind Waker, but I think Ocarina of Time is a close second for me.
You are totally right about the whole playing with them thing, because when you first meet Zelda, it is two kids meeting and plotting against this, and then you have that whole scene where he's kneeling in front of the king, and it's like, there's the man that's deceiving my father and all that. And I've heard it said that, like, it almost seems as if Ganon can actually hear them, which is why he looks directly at him. It's like he can totally hear these kids plotting, and he's like, oh please, like, these kids can do anything. And then that's why he disregards Link, is like, yeah, you're trying to do this stuff, but I don't need to worry about you. And he's right, he takes over all of Hyrule thanks to the absence of Zelda and Link.
By the way, real quick, that scene is a great example of how much fun Nintendo had with the camera controls that they had now, because the camera's like doing like swoops through the flowers and like framing it with roses on either side, like horribly pixelated roses, by the way. they definitely do some interesting camera work in this game.
Derek, you just touched on one of my favorite plot points of the game, which is, like Ganondorf sees these kids plotting and they don't seem like much of a threat, but in a funny way, those kids plotting is what allowed Ganondorf to take power in the first place. The only reason he was able to approach the Triforce is because Link opened the door in the Temple of Time to touch the Master Sword, and then he fell into a deep slumber, thus allowing Ganondorf free reign. And that's kind of messed up when you think about it. It's like, you have to go get the Master Sword, but in doing so, you're dooming Hyrule for 7 years, and that was directly a result of Link and Zelda as kids not thinking through the consequences of their actions, and I thought that was a really cool plot point.
Real quick, just to bring it back to Ganondorf in his final form, I think this is something that you might appreciate, John, and that's the fact that when I was taking on Pig Ganon again today, it reminded me of like an early version of the Elegante fight from Resident Evil 4, where like you're trapped in a small arena with against a giant creature, and this dude, I forgot about this part, he'll go around destroying all the structures around you too.
Oh, that's right.
Right, which even gives you inventory. So I'm like, oh man, this is awesome. This is just like Resident Evil 4, just like 10 years or like 6-8 years earlier. So
yeah, Capcom were clearly taking notes.
Yeah, that must have been it, right? There's something else I want to touch on real quick is getting back to the kind of the gameplay of this game in a more macro sense, I suppose, or maybe a more micro sense even, is that, like Breath of the Wild, this game really stepped up how much you could do in this world, like what all you can interact with. And as part of this, one of the big features that we take for granted now is the fact that the A button in this game does almost literally everything besides using your equipment. So if you want to like climb a ladder, drop off a ladder, pick up something, throw it, read a sign, it's all done with the A button. In fact, there's even a giant prompt on the screen telling you exactly what the A button would do at that point in time. It's just kind of funny to see that that's now a standard feature in games. Like, yeah, of course you have a button that interacts with everything, but this is kind of a new concept back then. The fact that there's so much to do in this world, you had to relegate it all to a single button that changes depending on context.
Yeah, that's just one of the many ways in which Ocarina of Time not only served as the template for future 3D Zelda games, but also informed general 3D action-adventure game design going forward as well.
Yeah, and they could have gotten that very wrong, because the N64 controller does have the C buttons, which are essentially 4 other buttons they could have used. And that could have gotten really confusing.
Yeah,
instead we got the nice inventory system, where you can quickly map some of your items onto the C buttons. And again, that's still something we see in modern games, just being able to quickly map these items yourself onto these extra buttons. And even modern Zelda games do that. They really did nail everything on their first try. Like, there's very few things they got wrong in Ocarina of Time that aren't in modern Zeldas.
The closest thing actually to Ocarina of Time with its 3-button inventory is actually Link's Awakening, which had a 2-button inventory at that time.
Right.
Yeah, and you're completely right about how easily it would have been to mess that up.
Well, look at Metal Gear Solid. And how confusing that game is to play.
Yeah, exactly. I'm just talking about another N64 game with me playing through Castlevania, recently playing Castlevania 64. Like, the controls scheme of that game is completely workable, but they decided to have some sort of different function to every one of the C buttons, whether it's picking up an item or camera control or something like that. There is always something attached to those C buttons, and I do have to think, like, okay, what does this one do again? What does this one do again? It's not as immediate as it is in Zelda, even though Castlevania 64 in that example does take a lot of inspiration from Zelda. So it's, even though it's influenced, not every developer really picked up on what made those systems so great.
And I'm guessing that Castlevania 64 had a jump button, right?
Yes.
Yeah, which Ocarina of Time didn't. And what's kind of funny is, I remember this, I mean, maybe I'm misremembering. It could, I'm not entirely sure, but I do seem to recall this being a big concern early on. Like, a lot of people were really freaking out about there not being a jump button in the game, which is weird because jumping's not something you normally do in Zelda for the most part, unless you have Rock's Feather.
Right.
And yet the way they incorporated it is just brilliant in this game, with how Link jumps whenever you need him to.
Yeah, I suppose when you look at a game like Breath of the Wild, that game needs a jump button because of how vertical the world is. Whereas in Ocarina of Time, basically everything you need is on that plane. Mm-hmm. And whenever they need to incorporate platforming, it just works with automatically being able to just step off the edge. So it never feels like a shortcoming, and if anything, it feels so natural to just walk off the edge and jump.
Right.
Because that's what you would be doing anyway.
Exactly.
I mean, yeah, just navigating in 3D space is something they really nailed in this game. Such as, for instance, you're quite often on, like, thin catwalks, and Link will automatically grab the ledge if you fall off, in most cases, not always. But it's another one of those small, like, quality of life things they added that could have been just a disaster had that feature not been there. Like, look at Turok, for instance. Anyone remember trying to jump around in that game and falling off constantly and having to redo all these puzzles?
Yes, I do remember that.
I think everyone does.
Again, just not to go focus too much on that, but you have to actually hold on to the jump button in order to hold on to a ledge in Castlevania 64. Like, it won't automatically grab it. If you let go of it, you'll just let go. Mm-hmm. It's completely unintuitive, unlike Zelda, where you just automatically grab the ledge, and then you just push up, or you can shimmy, or whatever you need to do. It's much better system. And again, that's the amazing thing. They did it on their first try.
This is why Nintendo's like gameplay first mantra like really shows through. Like, and first off, they prototype until the cows come home, until they have it mostly figured out before they start really working on the game itself. And even then, you can even tell with Ocarina of Time 2, I'd say to some degree. Like, the Ocarina of Time's designed to be a gameplay first experience, then they graft on the story afterward.
Well, yeah, one other element of the controls that I personally really liked was, this was back when Rumble was still in its infancy, but I really liked the Stone of Agony. It was such a cool way to, go treasure hunting with, your exploring the world, and suddenly you feel the controller rumbling in your hands. And that was just kind of a minor innovation that I feel like gets passed over a lot of the time, but personally I thought was pretty cool. And that was just, they were still exploring with different ways to use Rumble back then, because Star Fox 64 came out not too long before that, and that was what debuted Rumble.
Correct.
And so, yeah, they were still exploring it, and I thought the Stone of Agony was a kind of a cool way to utilize that feature.
I mean, imagine if, because we've all heard about the prototype of Ocarina of Time where it was actually structured more like Super Mario 64, with, Link being located in Hyrule Castle and accessing different levels or different areas through the castle just in the same way as Mario, and then they decided to go away from that. Imagine how different the game would have been if they had stuck to that, and I don't think that structure would have worked nearly as well as it did for Mario 64.
Yeah, you're very right, and that's actually got me thinking. Ocarina of Time is obviously still built within the limitations of an N64 cartridge, and the way the world is built is basically you're encouraged to revisit areas. So you start off and you have like the Kokiri Forest, you have Kakariko Village, you have all these areas that you basically revisit once you're an adult. And Skyward Sword did that too, where you just sort of have to revisit an area and there's another dungeon in there. But in Ocarina of Time, like, you kind of want to revisit all these areas, because, for one, you want to see what's changed in the world in 7 years. And I think it's just more interesting, this world, too. But, yeah, I think they really nailed that aspect of making the player want to revisit these areas. And it's crazy, because the world basically only has, like, 5 key areas, but it still manages to feel really vast, and it always feels like you're finding new areas to explore as you're going through the game, even though it essentially is just a couple of areas split into one world. Mm-hmm. So they made the best with what they had, and it still feels massive, even though it is within the limitations of the N64.
Yeah, I actually remember specifically one of the things I always felt the sense of scale was the desert, the Gerudo Desert and the Spirit Temple. Like, toward the end of the game, when you go to the Spirit Temple, I remember feeling like that actually felt, even though it wasn't that big in terms of the game world back then, it felt like you were on the other side of the world. It felt like you were a world away at this remote temple in the middle of this secluded desert, and that Hyrule, the main part of Hyrule, was so far away, and they did a really good job of making you feel like you had kind of struck out into the unknown and really, really gone far away from everything you had gotten familiar with up to that point.
I love the Spirit Temple as well, just because it really started playing with the time traveling mechanics. Like, you had to get there initially as adult Link, couldn't make any further, so you had to go back as young Link, which got you what you needed in order to do the next section. It was just, it might have been a little back and forth backtracking, but they kept it so tightly paced that it never felt like backtracking, even though it was continually coming back to that same area, and it was really satisfying to get through.
I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think the game almost employs a Harry Potter style of time travel, because I remember when you go to the windmill in the future in Kakariko Village, and the dude playing on his music box is really pissed off from some kid 7 years ago. Even though he didn't do anything yet at this point, but then if you go back in time and do what he was complaining about, sure enough, it activates something, and that's what pissed him off in the future.
I just love going to Lon Lon Ranch and having the guy who was basically the caretaker of the ranch becoming the owner 7 years later. I thought that was just such a neat evolution, and it shows how much like Ganondorf can affect the world. Mm-hmm. It's still kind of crazy, because I think a lot of games would sort of end the game when the villain wins and then just do the next in the sequel. But Ocarina of Time just made it had this ambition to have the villain winning be part of the game, and it just affects everything. And I think a lesser game would have just made a sequel out of that. So,
yeah, speaking of more of the time travel mechanic stuff, I remember one of my favorite moments of the game being going back to Kokiri Forest in the future, and because one of the smartest things I think Ocarina of Time does is it introduces you to so many NPCs when Link is a kid that you care about. Characters like Ruto, all the sages, and the Kokiri, and Malon, and Talon, and you're introduced to all these characters during the kid portion of the game, and then when you jump forward 7 years, suddenly you care about these characters. The game does a good job making you care and remember them. So the first thing you're thinking is like, oh man, what's happened to the Kokiri? What's happened to Malon? what's happened to all these characters that I grew to know over the course of the kid portion of the game, and discovering that is one of the game's greatest joys, in my opinion. And I thought rediscovering the whole forest area, going to the forest temple, and seeing how Saria felt about everything that had happened, I thought that was really interesting. And the game basically lets you experience that 6 times over with the various temples.
Yeah.
And it's really cool.
It's kind of heartbreaking too, because everyone in the Kokiri Forest has not aged one bit, and Link is the only one that has. And it gets you to start guessing what exactly is Link, because you always suspect that he's not really a Kokiri. And the game does elaborate on that after the Forest Temple. But when you go there and you're an adult, and they kind of recognize you, a few of them say you remind them of someone they knew. But most of them have no idea who you are, and that is kind of heartbreaking, and it gets back to that point of Link losing his childhood.
And there's other moments like that. That's definitely the most pronounced one, but each area you go back to for those first 3 have that moment. You meet Daruni, and he hasn't changed physically, but he now has a son who he names after you. That's a really cool moment in itself. And of course you have Rudo, who is now madly in love with you because of the whole situation before and the whole marriage situation. So yeah, it's really cool to just see how each of them handled those changes, and it is a stark craziness, especially for the Zora, to see them all frozen over like that. It gave a sense of Ganon's power that you never really got a sense of, even in Breath of the Wild. You hear everybody sort of just goes about their business.
Yeah, no one cares.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you kind of get that sense because you have this dark moment within the castle town, but then you leave and you head out into Hyrule Field, and then you get that same happy music. It's oh, okay, things aren't as bad, but then you start actually getting into the nitty gritty of each area and you realize how it's been affected.
Another one of my favorite moments, I was thinking about this, you touched on this earlier, John, is the bottom of the well, because what I love about that dungeon is that it's so creepy, but it's also when in the game it happens. It happens specifically when you've gotten comfortable playing as adult Link, and you're enjoying your newfound power, you've got the Master Sword, you're feeling confident, and suddenly you have this dungeon that you have to go back to being a kid for. And so not only are you oh, okay, so now I'm using my Kokiri sword again and the Deku shield, I feel like I've kind of powered down. Not only do you have to get used to playing as young Link again, but you have to do it in the scariest, most messed up dungeon in the game. And I love how basically the game forces you to become a child again, only to explore the scariest dungeon. And that's something that wouldn't have had as much impact, I think, if you were still adult Link.
Aren't there blood splatters or something too? In
Yeah.
that final room?
Oh, that's also where
Yeah.
Dead Hand is at. So and
Yeah.
everybody
Dead
remembers
Hand is
Dead
so
Hand.
messed up.
God.
It's so good. I love that. And the walls, you can see skulls and bones in the walls. Easily one of the darkest dungeons moments Zelda has ever had across the entire series.
No, absolutely. No, they really realized a world with this game, which is something that we hadn't seen too much of by this point. Certainly not with Zelda, especially. And as John was kind of touching on earlier, with some of the limitations of the 64 hardware, they have some clever workarounds in this game to kind of work around them. So a couple that come to mind, or spring to mind, are one, the use of pre-rendered backgrounds in this game, which is something that is very un-Nintendo-like. In fact, they haven't really done it since Ocarina of Time, at least in any of their main games. But here you can see it for a lot of interiors, like shop interiors, or outside the Temple of Time, or outside Castle Town as well, where you can explore the marketplace, again, against a fully CG background. And it was kind of cool in a way because it made it feel more real, because it did look real. It looked far beyond what the 64 could actually do in real time, even if it had a more limited camera perspective, like Resident Evil 2, for instance.
And I think I actually do like the pre-rendered backgrounds even today. I know they're kind of
Temple of
divisive.
Time looks great, yeah.
Yeah, oh, for sure. Castle Town's my favourite, though. I'm sure we'll get into 3DS comparisons more in a bit, but I love the vibe of the N64 version of Castle Town. I love how medieval it feels, and it just gives the entire place this sort of kind of an older feel, whereas Ocarina of Time 3D, it's a bit more jolly, it's a bit more a bit more modern maybe. And I much prefer how it feels in the N64 version.
Well, let's go ahead and move on then. Let's talk about what is the best way to play this game, in your opinion. So, John already touched on, of course, the 3DS version, which had quite a few quality of life improvements, such as even easier access to your inventory, which is great for the Water Temple, where you can just equip or unequip the the iron boots, just with a tap instead of going to the pause screen every time, which is a big improvement. But then they did make, they also, enhanced the graphics throughout the game, but that may not always be an improvement, as you mentioned, like such as with Castletown, and it kind of changing the vibe of the area in general.
Yeah, it's a hard thing, because I think gameplay-wise, unquestionably, the 3DS version is the way to play the game, mainly because of the menu improvements, the item use improvements you just went over, Andre. But in terms of atmosphere, I do love the 3DS version, but it's true, you lose some of that darkness in the adult version of the game, and stuff like the blood spatter in the bottom of the well, I think they take that out. Don't quote me on that, but I'm pretty sure that the more grisly stuff in bottom of the well is kind of toned down a bit.
Which is kind of an extension of how they even handled Ocarina of Time on the 64, where later versions changed Ganon's blood from red to green. Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And so they kind of kept going with that, dumbing things down just a bit in terms of atmosphere, and I really didn't like that. On the other hand, though, I am a big fan of the 3DS version for the specific way it improves the graphics. It improves them in a way that makes you think you're looking at what the game used to look like. But when you actually go back, you see how much better the 3DS version actually looks, but it's not obvious when you first play it. It's like, oh, this is what the game used to look like, yeah. But then you go back and it's like, whoa, the 3DS version looks so much better. But it looks better in a respectful way. It doesn't make the game look or feel completely different, other than those atmospheric changes that I just went over.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I agree, but I do wish they went a bit further with some forms of presentation, and mostly the soundtrack.
Yes.
Ocarina of Time soundtrack, which I cannot believe we haven't talked about the soundtrack yet, by the way. I mean, it's one of the best soundtracks ever. But the 3DS version is basically the exact same. I think they might have changed parts of it, but it still sounds much like the N64 version. And it feels so underwhelming, because they've gone really far to enhance the visual experience. But the audio one it doesn't really match the tone of the update. Like, if you're going to go all this way to update the visuals, at least go the full way and give us an updated musical score. Because the N64, while I like the sound font quite a bit, it's not always the best, and it doesn't do all these songs justice. And we've heard in Smash a lot of these songs. A lot of them sound brilliant when orchestrated. And Skyward Sword was the first orchestrated game, and that came out the same year as Ocarina of Time 3D. So it just felt kind of unambitious to have basically MIDI tracks on a 3DS.
That's a good point, real quick.
I agree.
In a general soundtrack sense, because Ocarina of Time, while, as you were saying, like I respect the compositions, the reality wasn't as good as a promise, I think. Because I think the N64 was stuck in this weird era where, actually its own thing. The PlayStation had none of these issues, where they were trying to make it sound better using, improved MIDI, but I don't know they actually accomplished that. Like, for instance, take Kakariko Village. I much prefer how it sounds on the Super Nintendo versus how it does in Ocarina of Time. And even going back now too, especially, like, whereas that hasn't been an issue for me with most Super Nintendo games, I still love how they sound. Ocarina of Time, I'm like, oh man, this is a little bit rough here.
Yeah, I completely agree. Like, I've always said that Ocarina of Time has an amazing soundtrack, but that the hardware, the N64's audio hardware held it back, because it just doesn't sound, these great compositions just don't sound that good being funneled through the sound font used for Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. Majora's Mask used the same thing. And I agree with you, John. They really needed to update that aspect of the presentation for the 3DS version, because that is one aspect of the original that hasn't aged well. And even back at the time, I don't think it was particularly great. Like, Andre, you were kind of touching on this, how there are several Super Nintendo games whose sound fonts sound better than what we got in Ocarina of Time, especially late-era SNES games like Final Fantasy VI and Chrono Trigger, and those just sounded better across the board in terms of the quality of their sound and the instruments used than Ocarina of Time did. And I do think that's one blemish that has endured, unfortunately.
Part of the reason for that, by the way, is just because the 64 had no dedicated sound hardware. So basically, however much of the CPU your game was using, or whatever you had left, was what the sound engineers had to make use of.
Right, although it's interesting, because you see certain games buck that trend, like Banjo-Kazooie and Super Smash Bros. Had samples that sound really good for the N64, but are still...
Because Rare's composers were gods.
that is for sure. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Grant Kirkhope.
Mm-hmm. I mean, as far as the actual songs themselves, they are absolutely brilliant. I've gone to the Symphony of the Goddess, and obviously a lot of Ocarina of Time tracks get played during that, and that concert like just shows like, man, if only there was another remake that really took advantage of that sound and went one step further. That would be really cool to see. To just see them go all out in the same way that we've seen like Crash Bandicoot or even Spyro, take the ideas, the feeling of those games and just modernize it and really make this world pop. Because even on 3DS, like Ocarina of Time looks way better, obviously, but it still feels kind of flat, kind of lifeless. Definitely, you're definitely playing a remake of an N64 game with no added materials. In the same sort of way, honestly, nowadays as Pokemon Let's Go, where you're playing an updated version of Kanto, but you're not getting any much more beyond like a graphical increase. It's still kind of barren as it was before. And I'd love to see them add just a bit more oomph to the proceedings of having these, having just go beyond that. And it'd be great too, especially if you get that full orchestral soundtrack. It'd be really great. And going back to just whether we prefer what the best way to play, I agree with Ash. The quality of life stuff for the 3D version makes it my preferred version, but it does have its weaknesses, mainly in the darkness. And one thing Ash didn't mention, I think, is the biggest loss beyond all the other atmosphere is the final boss fight with Ganon, because you can much more clearly see him, and you lose that ominous feeling about what is this form in the dark. It makes it just so freaky. Like he's almost more dragon-like than pig-like in the N64 version, and then you can sort of see what he looks. You can just see what he looks like much better in the 3D version, the 3DS version. It's still imposing, but not necessarily frightening.
Yeah, I guess so. For me, I've said before, I'm a bit of a purist. So I generally like to revisit games as they were originally designed and intended to be played, because whenever you update a game, you're very likely straying from the original vision, no matter, either in big or small ways or even in inconsequential ways. But I like to experience a game as most people did, which is how it was originally. But even putting that aside, I think Ocarina of Time 3D was actually a really good update. I think they improved it in some, in some key ways that I really don't oppose. However, for me, it's still, you're still playing on the 3DS, and I don't want to play a big epic game like Zelda on my 3DS if there's another way to play it. And that's why, when I went back to revisit it, partially why I wanted to replay it on the 64 so I could play it on the TV. So while I think Ocarina of Time 3D is one of the better updates out there, I don't know if it goes far enough to mitigate the screen size factor, which gets back to what Derek was saying. I would love if they actually just did a full proper HD updated this game in the style of Shadow of the Colossus, just redo everything.
Yeah.
Because if you're gonna go all if you're gonna upgrade the game and make it different, go the distance, change as much as you can, and I would love to see that version of Ocarina of Time.
I totally agree. I will say this. I agree with you, Andre, and Ocarina of Time is the kind of game that really demands a big screen, and I too would like that HD remake. However, and maybe one or maybe all of you will make fun of me for this, but I cannot in this discussion without mentioning that the stereoscopic 3D is actually really good.
That Mega Man HD Rumble will come up no matter what discussion.
I know. It's true. But, I still think that stereoscopic 3D was really cool. I replay some of the 3DS version for this discussion, and I was using the 3D, and it really does add something to the game. So I don't want to gloss over that. That was a really cool addition to this otherwise classic game, that it just gave you literally a whole new dimension to see all these familiar areas, and I just thought it was really cool.
It probably would have helped at that freaking tennis match against Ganondorf earlier. So
exactly, yeah.
That's definitely not worth laughing at, Ash, because when you're in the Hyrule Field and you put the stereoscopic 3D slider all the way up, you can almost see for miles. It feels so deep. I think Ocarina of 3D, I think, is one of the best examples of 3D. And when you're in Kokiri Forest and you have all those particles flying around, and it feels like you can see each layer of them, and sometimes they fly out of the screen too.
It is one of the best uses of 3D on the 3DS.
Yeah, it was a well done port, and it definitely did enhance it in some smart ways.
One way, actually, being the gyro controls. I was playing the archery earlier, the minigame in Kakariko Village. And I always struggle with that on N64, but on 3DS, it's so easy and so smooth. You just point and let go, and that is literally it.
Oh yeah, no, I was replaying that same shooting game, and I was really hating how it felt on the 64. Like, this is such a pain in the ass. And even too, that came up again during the fight with Ganondorf, where you have to aim the light arrows at him, and you have like maybe a second or two to get it in. And hey, good luck with that horrible aiming on the with a control stick. So, yeah, the gyro controls are definitely a big improvement there as well. All right, well, let's go ahead and I want to move on to another topic here, and that is. Since most of us had the chance to revisit the game, this is, of course, in a time where Breath of the Wild now exists. And I want to talk about what it's like to go back to Ocarina of Time after playing Breath of the Wild. So I guess, John, for you, like, what did it feel like? Was it weird going back to an earlier version of Breath of the Wild, essentially?
No, it actually wasn't. I think Breath of the Wild is a very different game, but it's not necessarily a better game. And I feel that way about most Zeldas. Like, most of them have something unique going on about them. And in Ocarina of Time's case, it still feels ambitious in a lot of ways. And the main difference between the two games is Ocarina of Time is more of a linear story. So obviously Breath of the Wild, the main point of that game is the wild. In Ocarina of Time, though, the main point is to go around and do all these dungeons and go for the story. And these dungeons are so well designed, and the whole pacing of this adventure, I think, is one of the best. It's one of the most well-paced games in this medium. It feels like just the amount that you do in between dungeons, the amount of time that dungeons last, and everything that's going on in between them. It just feels so well realized. So when I go back to exploring Hyrule, I think Breath of the Wild has the strength there, where exploring is more fun and more rewarding, but Ocarina of Time just has such a different feel to it. So I think it still totally holds up against Breath of the Wild.
No, I totally agree. For me, it kind of felt like coming home, and I say this as someone who really loved Breath of the Wild, and I think, Breath of the Wild for me made me enjoy an open world game when traditionally I don't. But I do like the focus, and I like that Ocarina of Time is streamlined, at least compared to Breath of the Wild. It wasn't in its time, but compared to Breath of the Wild it is, and I like that it's focused. And I'll tell you one thing, I enjoyed, even inside the Deku Tree, the very first dungeon, I enjoyed that dungeon more than any single dungeon in Breath of the Wild. That is one of the weakest parts of that game, in my opinion. And I think the dungeons in Ocarina of Time absolutely do hold up, and they're more fun to play today than I think Breath of the Wild's dungeons are. So there are certain elements coming back to Ocarina of Time. I agree with you, John. The exploration is more rewarding and more interesting in Breath of the Wild, but the in-between parts and the dungeons and just the overall focus that you get from the lack of a truly open world, I think that holds up, and I kind of prefer that approach.
Wait, did you just say the Deku Tree is better than every shrine in Breath of the Wild?
No, I didn't say shrine. I meant the 4 dungeons, the 4 divine beasts.
Okay, even that I'm gonna disagree with, because, and this kind of ties into one of my points, because
let me qualify it. Actually, I didn't say they're better. I said I like them more.
Okay, whatever you said.
Okay, fine.
When I was trying to break through that freaking spider web again, from which you have to jump from the top level to the floor, and you have to land on the spider web. I did that 4 freaking times in a row. It didn't break on any of them, even though I'm pretty sure I was hitting it like almost dead center, and I have no idea what I was doing wrong until arbitrarily on the 5th time I finally broke through. And this kind of like ties into something, to a broader point I want to make about the game, is that, so I'm actually going to disagree with you guys. I loved Ocarina of Time when it came out. I still enjoy the game. I think now, in a world of Breath of the Wild, it's a little bit hard to go back now to some of the mechanics and the design of the original game. And this is coming from someone who, remember, I didn't even say I love Breath of the Wild. I liked it a lot. But I appreciate a lot of the things it did, and now going back, Ocarina of Time just feels so digital in its nature. Like, every solution is either you got it or you didn't. There's no other way around it. There's always just one solution. And as an example of this, I was in Dodongu's cavern earlier, and I was in one of those rooms where you did light a torch, because that's in pretty much every dungeon in some degree. And in this room, though, where you have to light all the torches, there are the little mini Dodongus that spit fire at you. I'm like, hey, I wonder, since I ran out of the Deku sticks to catch on fire, I wonder if I can have these guys light the torches for me, but I had them breathe right onto it. And so I lured one over, had them blow fire all over the thing. It did nothing. So I had to go find a Deku stick, light that with a lit torch, and then bring it over to the others. Even beyond the individual puzzles, the game as a whole, I mean, everything about the game is structured like a puzzle, in which every element is dependent on some other. You can't, you're gated constantly in this game, in which, you know, everything's like interconnected. You can't go to Dodongo's cavern until you cure the Goron leader of his depression, which you can only do by having Saria's song, which you can only get by doing the things up to that point. And it just felt so limiting going back now, and so artificial, I suppose. So whereas Breath of the Wild does a great job of making this feel like a live world in which you can do anything and nothing is like fully dependent on something else. You have all your tools available from the get-go. Going back to Ocarina of Time, it feels so artificial, and it kind of digs at that, you know, live world, which at the time felt amazing, but now it just feels so much like a game, whereas Breath of the Wild didn't.
I mean, that's true. I mean, those are all true points, but I guess I see those things differently. I agree with everything you just said, but I mean, at the end of the day, it is a game, and I don't really mind that sequential nature of it. Like, I really do enjoy linear games, and I don't mind having to do this specific thing before another thing. I think what you talked about in Breath of the Wild, those are all strengths, absolutely. But it's, for me, at least personally, what you described doesn't make it. Those aren't negative qualities that make it hard for me to go back to Ocarina of Time. They're of their era, and I still appreciate that kind of design today, even if today it might feel a little dated. But I don't know. I've said in many discussions that I still love linear games, and, you know, maybe for better and worse, but
it's very tightly designed, and there's definitely aspects where I agree with you at there, Andre. Like that torch thing with the mini Dodongos, that would have been genius if that would have lit the torches too. And I wish it did. And maybe having more solutions would make the world feel a bit more dynamic. And I guess the answer is just it's off its time, so I guess that's why a lot of the elements aren't there. But that's not an excuse for quality. Like if we're judging it by today's standards, then that is a mark against the game. And I think I'm kind of okay with it, though. I'm okay with these puzzles being designed the way they are. I'm okay with them having limited solutions. But yeah, it's difficult to say whether that would make them better or not. And I think part of it would. But I think that it's just so clear of its solutions, though. And it's a shame that spiderweb puzzle didn't work for you, because I think that's genius. I think that's using the 3D planes to the best ability. Like, it's saying, like, we have 3D space now, climb all the way up here and jump down to the bottom plane again. That's something you can't do in 2D. And yeah, it's a shame that didn't work for you, because that's such a genius puzzle.
I am curious about that, because I was replaying the 3DS version, and I got that spiderweb puzzle on one try, so I'm wondering if maybe that was a technical problem specific to the original N64 version.
It could be. Yeah, it might be one of those things they ironed out. But yeah, I just use it as a launching off point for just how, like, binary everything is, right? Like, there's usually only one solution, and even then, it's very rigid in how you go about it. Like, you know, there's block puzzles all over this game, and God, pushing those is not fun.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, I definitely agree.
When I got to the milk crates at Hyrule Castle, where to push, you know, 2 of them so you can jump the gap, I'm like, oh my God, just come on, Link. You can beat up enemies 10 times your size, but you can barely push this little block around, a little box around. So yeah. So I mean, again, I'm not disparaging Ocarina of Time. I think it's a great game. I think it was amazing for its time. It's just that now I think it is starting to show its age, and there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I don't think I think classic movies shouldn't necessarily be updated to appease modern audiences. It's like, you know what? I absolutely appreciate what it did, but I can see how it's leading now to, you know, even bigger and better things. And those improvements can make it hard to go back to the original. Even though I still enjoyed it, I don't get the same experience I did 20 years ago.
While I don't necessarily agree with the puzzle point, I do feel that sense of artificialness when it comes to combat. When you're fighting Dark Knights, they are very routine-based. So basically you can't attack these guys unless their shield is down. So the majority of the time, you're just waiting for them to put their shield down, and you can just be standing there for such a long time with nothing happening at all. And the fights against the Dark Knights used to feel really epic, but now it's like, oh god, just put your shield down so I can hit you.
That's a good point. Like, I actually loved the battle system originally in Ocarina of Time, and I still really enjoy it. But you can definitely see, like, the limits of it now, where they have improved it in the subsequent games.
I mean, I didn't get a chance to replay it, but I mean, I can definitely see all of those points where I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing to have like you need to do this thing in order to solve this puzzle, in order to access this next part, in order to continue forward with the game. I think on a first playthrough, that's fun because you're figuring out what I need to do with each of those steps, what needs to be done, and cluing into what the game's trying to hint towards, and that in itself is a very enjoyable experience. But it's also, as you said, quite different from Breath of the Wild, where you had 16 different solutions for one puzzle that everybody had their own different experience with, which makes exploration great. But when it came to the actual dungeons, as far as the beasts, it just never caught that same interest. And I'm split on which one I prefer. Like if they could find a proper way to mix the two and have experiences like the ones you attempted with the Dodongos, we could be in for something truly special when it comes to dungeon design that we just haven't seen before in any kind of capacity, where you can just do whatever you feel like and just sort of maybe chain together all those different the little moments that they had in Breath of the Wild into a much bigger experience that is just that much more rewarding. And it can be tough to go back to those games that you've experienced dozens of times before, you know the solution to, so that's what makes the block pushing even more of a pain. It's just like, oh my god, please come on, and it's just a subject of the time. I can totally see that bit, but I still appreciate those moments, and it's something I would want to change if we ever got our hypothetical HD remake. But for the original, I'm not gonna dock it points, for example.
Well, I mean, I'm not saying to dock it points. Again, I think this game was brilliant when it came out, but I mean, I'm being realistic too. It's like
exactly,
it is harder to play these days than it was then, and I still think it's worth doing, but I think that's only going to continue to be the case. The farther removed from Ocarina of Time we get, I think the harder it will be to go back, especially once we see whatever Breath of the Wild 2 ends up being, for instance. So I do want to clarify one thing, because I don't think I was very eloquent in my point. It's not that I don't like the linear games, because I do, and it's not that I have anything against the the very interlocking nature of everything, which you need like key A to unlock door B or whatever, and throughout the game. It's just more in how they did it in Ocarina of Time. It feels so artificial now, with these story moments being tied up to these individual aspects you need. Like for instance, again, getting back to the Goron leader, where I had to get this very specific song in order to cure his depression, and it just feels like very perfunctory, maybe. I don't know. It just feels very artificial when it comes to the story now. So I guess my point is that the gameplay, which is rewarding, comes at the expense of the story and believability of the world. It's a little bit similar to the problem Uncharted has, where the gameplay comes at the expense of the narrative, in which Nathan Drake seems like an everyday guy, but he's murdering thousands of people. So that's kind of what it reminds me of. So that's where I'm coming from.
An impossible finger strength.
Yeah, exactly.
I guess Ocarina of Time also sort of introduced the problem where you'd get an item, and then that item just stops being used after a while. And maybe that's because dungeons sort of built around like teaching you that one item, and then moving on to another item in the next dungeon. So I wonder if they design the world where you just have all your items from the beginning, like in Breath of the Wild, and you can just go to any dungeon. Would that have solved that problem? Would they have designed it differently? Because the order that you visit dungeons in is very linear. Like you start off in the Deku Tree, and then you go to Dodongo's Cavern, and then it just goes on along like that. And from A Link to the Past, where you basically had those first 3 dungeons, and then you can do the other ones in kind of any order you want. And I think that's what the Zelda team sort of focused on in the future. Like A Link Between Worlds, basically let you do any dungeon. Breath of the Wild, any dungeon. And I guess going back to it, having that fixed order is maybe a bit dated in modern Zelda standards.
However, I would argue that allowing you to visit dungeons and whatever you want, as in both A Link Between Worlds and Breath of the Wild, carries with it its own issues, such as the fact that there is no difficulty scaling. As much as I enjoyed A Link Between Worlds, one of the things I really didn't like about it is that Turtle Rock is just as easy as the Eastern Palace. Maybe not exactly, but generally the difficulty doesn't scale up because Nintendo had to account for the idea that players are going to visit dungeons beyond the first, I think, 2 in any order. And that, I really didn't like that aspect of it. Same with Breath of the Wild. You know, you can visit them in any order you want, but Va Meadow doesn't really feel meaningfully easier or more difficult than Va Naboris. And I like that kind of sequential ratcheting up of difficulty. It makes the stakes feel higher. Like, I expect the final dungeon to be a lot harder than the first dungeon. I want the game to test me. And when you have that open world, go anywhere you want, do any dungeon you want in any order design, you kind of can't do that. And so I do think that that design, while it does have its advantages, also carries with it its own blemishes.
I totally agree with that, Ash.
Yeah, it's hard to argue against that, because you are right. That is the weakest aspect of A Link Between Worlds. As much as I love that game, it's not a hard one at all. But it's the scaling aspect. I think they need to find a way, like, you beat this many dungeons or whatever, and everything scales up. And they kind of had that in Breath of the Wild, but there was still a point I think everybody got to where it's like the opening is really tough, surprisingly tough in Breath of the Wild, but then after you get your footing and a few key items and hearts and all that stuff, all of a sudden it's like, okay, I can handle this. This is no big deal. It just got easier and easier, even though they were making the enemies tougher the farther you went.
All right, well, to kind of wind things down here and wrap things up, and of course end on a much more positive note, because again, I really do, and this game was amazing, and I think it still holds up remarkably well for how old it is. But I want to focus on more your favorite moments from the game, like anything we haven't touched on yet that stood out to you in memory, that made a big impact on you either at the time or still to this day. So yeah, what are your favorite moments from Ocarina of Time?
I had a stupid moment when when I first played the game. I didn't know where the Kokiri sword was. I couldn't find that tunnel anywhere. So what I did was basically just get a bunch of rupees and buy a bunch of Deku sticks. and I didn't know what to do. So I went into the Lost Woods and made my way all the way to where that wolf appears. So once you solve the puzzle and make it into that area, when you've gone through all the tree trunks. And I beat the wolf using a bunch of Deku sticks, which I went through quite a lot because I didn't know you were meant to hit his tail at the time. And then I went all the way down to where the forest temple begins, and I was just like, what am I supposed to do? And
So good.
In hindsight, though, I love that I got lost, and I love that I made it that far with a bunch of Deku sticks.
Yeah.
So, yeah, my favorite thing about Ocarina of Time was it allowed me to make that mistake, and I still felt good for doing it.
That is awesome. I actually I didn't even remember you could go to that point. You could go that far into the game without going to the Deku tree first.
Right?
Yeah, I didn't either, I don't think.
That's kind of amazing.
It's hard because I feel like we've already covered so many. We talked about Ganon.
All right, I've got one.
Time traveling.
Fine.
All right.
Fishing. Hell yeah, fishing.
Oh man,
This game,
Nice.
I mean, this is another mainstay of the series now, in a way. Like, if fishing isn't there, people are like, where is fishing at? This is such a fun, like, diversion in the game. Like, yeah, most of the game is, like, it's spent in a dark future where you're trying to save the world. But if you need a break, why not go to the old fishing hole and, like, try and catch, some fish for fun? Or if you want, you can have the most epic battle of all time against a Hylian Loach, which is, that legit is the hardest battle in the game. What I love too about the Hylian Loach is, like, he was a mystery. Like, that was like almost like an urban legend for like months, if not years. Like, you would only hear tales of people, like, catching the Loach, and you would never know for sure until, I think it was Nintendorks.com. I think they caught it while at E3 one year, and they posted a video of it. People were like, oh my god, it exists, holy crap. And I love that. Like, that's something you can't really get these days, although, as Ash will say, Breath of the Wild is what got closest to that. But I just love how a fishing hole of all places is what led to one of the game's greatest mysteries. Besides, of course, the rumor that the Triforce is actually in the game.
But Breath of the Wild doesn't have fishing, so 1 point for Ocarina of Time.
You can go bomb fishing.
True.
Yeah.
I was actually going to make that exact point, Andre, when you were talking about the urban legend aspect of the Hylian Loach, the Triforce. I was so. Like, that was such a huge part of early internet culture. Like, if you were a Zelda fan, you were playing Ocarina of Time, and you were talking to people online, there were all these rumors, like, oh man, the Triforce is here, you can get the Triforce, there's the Light Temple, and there's the Sky Temple, and I was so into all of that. I got so into the schoolyard rumor aspect of Ocarina of Time, and, like, I started using Pro Action Replay and teasing out beta elements of the game and playing, like, beta elements of Zelda Ocarina of Time, and I just, the Triforce wasn't in the game. It never was, never will be. But that mystery aspect and how it just absolutely took over video game internet culture in the late 90s, I'll never forget that aspect of Ocarina of Time, and I just think that was a really cool aspect of the game that isn't within the game itself, but is part of the impact it had at the time.
Yeah, I mean, anything we'll open up the discussion to anything you want to touch on about the game that we haven't already. So
Cool. Well, that was definitely, in terms of the game's overall impact, a favorite moment of mine, just in terms of the game in general. But within the game, one thing I haven't mentioned is the first time I scaled Death Mountain, and you turn around and you see just how far you've come. Both you can see the mountain path and all this way down below, and just the immense verticality you got from scaling Death Mountain. And I'll never forget how cool that was, feeling like you really did scale an actual mountain.
And you can see Kakariko Village right down below.
Yeah,
it's so
exactly.
Well done.
Yeah. For me, this was around the time I started really discovering the potential of stories in games. Like, I had started with Final Fantasy and had Metal Gear Solid, and then going into Zelda, which I think still had a really interesting story at the time, even though it's still very simple, but it kept me intrigued. And my friend that I did borrow I traded in my PlayStation for his N64 for a short time so he could play Final Fantasy VII, and I could play Ocarina of Time. And that's how I was able to experience it in 1999. And thankfully, he did not spoil anything about the game for me. So I was going in blind other than what I had seen at the kiosks. And so the moment where Sheik revealed herself as Zelda was a legit surprise for me. I'm like, holy crap, that is amazing. Like, I did not see it coming. I just thought, I had no idea where Zelda I didn't really think about it. I just was sort of going along with it because, again, stories were just so new to me at the time. And it was just a really neat moment to just have this kind of, at least for me, a legit plot twist when it comes to that.
Mm-hmm. I remember that exact moment. I was legit surprised too, and I was just watching this cutscene, and my mum goes, "Jonathan, dinner's ready." I was like, 5 more minutes! I was so into this.
You know, it's funny, looking back, this was the first time that any of us mentioned Sheik, and Sheik is supposed to be this, this major element of this game, but in hindsight, Ocarina of Time absolutely wasted that character. Mm-hmm. Like, what a cool character.
She's the Phasma of Zelda.
Yeah, it's really unfortunate because you've got this cool ninja alternate form of Zelda when the big plot reveal happens, and literally as soon as that reveal happens, she gets kidnapped. And it's like they could have done so much more with Sheik, even playable sequences, but you've got this cool ninja character that literally serves no purpose other than to teach Link songs and cutscenes and get kidnapped. That's all she does.
That's so right.
Yeah.
It's a good point.
It's very unfortunate. And fortunately, later games have sort of fulfilled Sheik's potential.
Smash Brothers, especially.
Smash Brothers, Hyrule Warriors. Yeah, it's really fulfilled what Sheik is capable of. But you're right, Ash. She's just a music teacher in that game. But it was still like you felt connected to her because she just kept showing up, and then to have that reveal, it made it much more memorable. And it's a ninja.
Another one of my favorite moments, real quick, is just when I got the game, is just getting the game and seeing that gold box for the first time with a gold cartridge, assuming you pre-ordered. I think only pre-orders got it, maybe a select amount of early copies of the game. Otherwise, you got stuck with a boring box and gray cartridge. So that was amazing at the time. Like, it really lent to the idea that this was an event. This was an event game, and it was in every sense of the word.
But not in Europe, because we only got the grey cartridge.
Oh, man.
Oh, man.
Too bad. You haven't had the definitive Zelda experience yet, Ocarina of Time experience. You need that gold cartridge for it.
We got a gold Majora's Mask at the very least, but no, they cheaped out with us.
To be fair, Majora's Mask does have a sweet lenticular cover too, or on the game, which actually has a 3D effect before Majora's Mask 3D even did. So.
We didn't get that either.
What?
Oh,
my God,
man, that
sucks. I had forgotten how poorly Europe was treated for a long time with games.
Oh yeah, and Ocarina of Time, basically every N64 game runs at 50 Hz in Europe, so if you found the text speed in Ocarina of Time slow, play the European version. It is even slower.
That's actually one of the things that actually really dates Ocarina of Time, I think, is how slow the text is in this game. And it sucks because there are times when you can skip it, but if you try to, it'll skip literally everything. It'll just go to the very end of the conversation. So that part is a mess. So they've also improved that in more recent games.
Ocarina of Time 3D has a much faster text speed, but I don't like the font. Maybe I'm just being picky. I don't like that font.
No, that's fair.
I much prefer the original
that's fair.
font.
Yeah.
one more favorite moment that came up while I was thinking. The first time I got the fire arrow, because I think there's like a plaque that says, fire an arrow into the morning light or something, and it's pretty obvious. In hindsight, obviously, it's pretty obvious. But I was thinking, well, maybe just fire an arrow into the morning sun. So I remember waiting all night and thinking, okay, let's just try this. It's never going to work, and it worked. I was like, that was such a cool moment where I'm like, whoa, what's going on? I got the fire arrow. Like, that was a cool environmental puzzle that I didn't think I'd actually figured out, but I did, and that was like a cool, memorable moment for me.
So you just reminded me of actually one of my favorite things, me and my friends' favorite things to do in the game. In that same area in Lake Hylia, we would climb to the very top of the laboratory. There was almost like a lookout up there. And for whatever reason, the crows love to attack you here. So we would always equip the fire arrow and just go on a crow hunting binge. And it was so fun. It was like who could rack up the top score, and you'd see like these flaming crows just go flying off into the distance. That's awesome. It was amazing. So yeah, I loved that. That was just so fun. And I wasn't kidding earlier when I said like it really did feel like Breath of the Wild. Like how Breath of the Wild feels now is how Ocarina of Time did then. I think that's partially why I think it is dated now in many respects, because we've seen because people can experience what that was to us back then now in the form of Breath of the Wild.
Also, the trading mission for the Begoron sword, the first time I was going through that and figuring out where I needed to go, what I needed to do, the first time I attempted to teleport in order to cut down on the time and having it break, I'm like, oh crap, they really are forcing me to do that. And I remember the first time I played it, it felt so much harder, but then I did it again in 3D and was like, well, that's a piece of cake. Why was I having so much trouble before?
This might be opening a whole box of worms, but okay. Andre, I know Majora's Mask is one of your favorite games. How does Ocarina of Time compare to it to you?
Oh man, so even before replaying it here, I've actually long always felt that Majora's Mask to me is not just a better game, but also holds up better in my opinion. I also realize and respect that it's very divisive, and I get that. If you are not into the time mechanic, I can absolutely see why you would hate this game. But I think it is better. I think it hurts me when I see Alan Numa always say how he's trying to best Ocarina of Time, and I'm like, man, buddy, you did with your first Zelda game. The first main Zelda game you helmed. You did it. Great job. You took the fundamentals of Ocarina and improved them. So yeah, for me, I think Majora's Mask is a better game, and when I was talking about it briefly just a few moments ago, it got me really excited because in just 2 years, guys, we could talk about the 20th retrospective of that game.
Nice.
Yeah, I've never played the N64 version of Majora's Mask, at least not beyond the first 3 days, because I didn't know what I was getting myself into. I didn't realize you were supposed to run out the 3 days, so I was panicking and trying to figure out what the heck I was supposed to do. I was like, I don't know what's going on, what's happening, all that stuff. Like there was a real stress going on, so I had to just stop when I first went to play it. But I also remember one of the first things you do is use the jumping mechanics in order to go up those different logs, and Link has these awesome new animations where he's like, you can see the growth of him, exactly, the flips and stuff, and I'm like, holy crap, this is cool. Like, I don't know why, but that opening cutscene where he's clinging on to Epona as it's getting stolen, and that opening moments where he's jumping around and doing all those flips now, it's like, oh man, Link's badass as a kid now. It really stuck with me.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really interesting sequel. I don't know if I prefer it to Ocarina of Time, though. I think Ocarina of Time has the better dungeons and maybe the better pacing. But Majora's Mask is, it does more with the smaller world. And that game is definitely about its world, about the characters. And if you're just going to get lost in that world and in the side quests, then Majora's Mask is the better game. But for the actual adventure and the actual story, I think I prefer Ocarina still.
Oh man, see, this is why you kind of hit on something there with how I think it's a smaller, denser game, and that's why I'm so excited for Breath of the Wild too. Like if they take that same idea, like the same kind of like general concept for what Majora's Mask was to Ocarina of Time and do it to Breath of the Wild, man, I want to see what that looks like. Like a more focused, smaller scale adventure. Yeah, I really can't wait. So
yeah, Eventide Island was my favorite thing in Breath of the Wild, and if you can just have that kind of thing, but on a little bit of a grander scope, then I'll be very happy.
By the way, real quick, I'm watching gameplay of Ocarina of Time right now. I have been this entire time, and one of my favorite moments, real quick, in this game is when you get Epona and you're trapped, you're locked in the pen. The dude just locks you in. It's like, how in the hell do I get out? And it feels so good when you realize you can run at the wall and you literally jump the wall outside over the fence outside the ranch and into Hyrule Field. What a great feeling that was.
Yeah, absolutely.
And with that, I think that brings us to the end of our Ocarina of Time retrospective. So thank you so much for watching, guys. And if you like this video, first off, let us know what you think of it or thought of it. We may do more in the future if you guys want to see more, especially because I want to do one from Majora's Mask now. And of course, stay tuned to GameXplain for lots more on everything Zelda and Nintendo Switch as well. We'll catch you later. Bye.